particular favorites. Millions of new citizens, so the papers claimed, had welcomed their incorporation into the Soviet Union following the annexations of the Baltic states, eastern Poland, Bessarabia, and part of Finland. The war now waging in the West was given wide coverage, evenly balanced between reports from the British and reports from the Germans. Every paper reproduced the good wishes, all couched in suspiciously similar language, which people from all over the country had sent to their great leader, Joseph Stalin, the father, teacher, great leader of the Soviet people, heir to the cause of Lenin, creator of the Stalin Constitution, transformer of nature, great helmsman, great strategist of the revolution, genius of mankind, and greatest genius of all times and peoples. All the papers, even the army paper Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, contained long and sentimental poems and stories by well-known writers such as Konstantin Paustovsky, as well as by the regime's own hacks. With a little bit of experience, you could read behind the bland reports and the artificial enthusiasm of the leading articles to discover quite a bit about what was really going on in the world. Almost everyone in the artistic, political, or military world had lost a relative or a friend during the recent purges. All but the most powerful lived in accommodation which was inadequate at best, squalid at worst. But ordinary people clutched at whatever grounds for hope they could perceive. 2 years earlier, Stalin had appointed Lavrenti Beria as Commissar for Internal Affairs to curb the excesses of the NKVD, the ubiquitous secret police. Arrests continued, of course, but, so far at least, things seemed better than they had been under his predecessor. There was now food in the shops again. Rationing had been abolished, and people were no longer hungry, as they had been only a few years earlier. And they were genuinely proud of what the regime had done for their city, the spectacular new metro, the new schools, the new openings in higher education, the new jobs in the new factories, the official support for the performing arts, the glittering opportunities for writers and artists, at least for those who could adapt to the official line. Moscow was the city of opportunity in the first country of socialism. Moscow was still a city of first- and second-generation peasants, people who had flooded into the capital in search of jobs and careers. They had not forgotten the horrors of collectivization and famine. Some hoped that war would come and sweep away the hated collective farms which Stalin had imposed on the countryside. But the genuine enthusiasm which had fueled the revolution 24 years earlier was still there despite the horrors which had succeeded it. Had not Stalin said that when you chop wood, the chips are bound to fly? After all, you could not make an omelette or forge utopia without breaking eggs. Most people in Moscow believed, or desperately wanted to believe, the official line that their country would keep out of the war which had engulfed the rest of Europe. If war came, nevertheless, years of official propaganda had convinced them that the Red Army, with its huge air force and its fleets of tanks, more tanks than the whole of the rest of the world put together, would certainly repel the invader and carry the battle onto his territory in a matter of days. Stalin and his generals were not as sanguine as they wanted the public to think. The pact with Hitler in August 1939 had given the Soviet Union a new buffer zone to the west. It had been meant to secure a breathing space. But the overwhelming German victory in France had overthrown every calculation. For the last 10 days in December 1940, the generals met in Moscow to draw the lessons. Most of them went home when the military conference ended on New Year's Eve. The most senior stayed behind to begin the business of putting the lessons into practice. A white swan died late that night in the Moscow Zoo. It was the worst possible omen for the new year to come. Part 1. The Slow Approach of Thunder. Chapter 1. The Shaping of the City. By one measure, the number of people involved, the Battle of Moscow was the greatest battle in the Second World War, and therefore the greatest battle in history. More than 7 million officers and men from both sides took part, compared with the 4 million who fought in Stalingrad in 1942, the 2 at Kursk in 1943, the 3.5 in the Battle for Berlin in 1945. This was a scale never matched in the fighting in Western Europe and Africa. The Battle of Moscow swirled over a territory the size of France, and lasted for 6 months, from September 1941 to April 1942. The Soviet Union lost more people in this one battle, 926,000 soldiers killed, to say nothing of the wounded, than the British lost in the whole of the First World War. Their casualties in this one battle were greater than the combined casualties of the British and the Americans in the whole of the Second World War. This was the horrendous price they paid for inflicting on the Wehrmacht the first real defeat it had ever suffered. They fought the Germans to a standstill, bled them white, and hurled them back hundreds of miles from the very walls of their capital. The Wehrmacht went on to win more dazzling victories on the plains of southern Russia in the summer of 1942, but in their hearts many Germans already knew that if the Battle of Moscow was not the beginning of the end, it was most certainly the end of the beginning. Even today, Moscow, strangled by traffic, poisoned by the exhalations of decrepit factories, disfigured by the exuberant constructions of a vulgar and rampant capitalism, is a city which throbs with power. The focus and symbol of that power is still, as it always has been, the fortress of the Kremlin, the magnificent and awe-inspiring central point of an imperial city. Russia may now be bereft of empire, but the overwhelming aura of the Kremlin remains. The successors of the Tsars and the Bolsheviks still rule the country from behind the great walls of red brick that surround the offices, the grand palaces, and the glittering churches bearing the gold crosses of Russia's ancient Orthodox faith. Above the churches and the palaces, even today, the high towers of the fortress are crowned with the great red stars of illuminated glass, the symbols of a ruthless regime under whose banners the men and women of the Soviet Union held and then destroyed the German invader in the greatest war in history. Beyond the Kremlin walls, Moscow seems to be a rambling chaos of churches and monasteries, now once again crowned with golden cupolas which glow in the sunset, of great palaces and public buildings, of Stalinist fantasies, of drab offices and slums from the 1960s and 1970s, of exuberant post-Soviet kitsch. This is the city which has given Europe some of its greatest science, painting, music, and literature. This is the city where Pushkin and Dostoevsky were born, and where Tolstoy and Chekhov spent much of their working lives. Far more than the coldly formal city which Peter the Great built for himself amid the marshes of the Baltic Sea, Moscow is the core and the essence of Russia itself. Sprawling, huge, unmanageable, a country both of Europe and apart from it. Moscow is a city which fascinates and obsesses the citizen and the stranger alike. Without Moscow, European culture as we know it would look very different. Beneath all its apparent chaos, Moscow, like Vienna, is shaped by a simple logic, the logic of defense. Like Vienna, the core of Moscow is a defensive fortress on the bank of a river, protected by concentric lines of fortification, and joined to the outside world by great highways radiating to all the points of the compass. The course of the Battle of Moscow in 1941 was determined by the city's geographical position and climate, by the network of roads of which it was the center, and by the shape of the city itself, as it developed through the centuries in response to the actions of powerful men. The countryside around Moscow, the Podmoskvy, undulates gently and undramatically across an endless sandy plain. The Moscow River and its tributaries wind across it, a place of fishermen and holiday-makers, of swimmers and sunbathers in times of peace, but an obstacle in time of war. The countryside has been partly cleared for agriculture, but even today thick forests of silver birch and black pine still cover much of the land, dark and impenetrable except along the roads or paths that have been hacked through them. It is a landscape which does not impose itself on the observer. It has nothing of the wild grandeur of the Alps, or the cultivated beauty of England or Italy. But it speaks to the deepest emotions of the Russian people, emotions which are captured even for the foreigner by Russia's landscape artists of the 19th century. Napoleon's veterans complained as they marched across these endless plains that the heat was as bad as it had been in Egypt. The dust cast up by the marching men and vehicles was so thick that the sun was sometimes reduced to a dim red disk, and drums had to be sounded at the head of every battalion to prevent the rear from losing its way. The dust killed Napoleon's horses and draft animals in their tens of thousands, and ground and clogged the engines of Hitler's tanks and lorries until they seized up. The winters are as cold as the summers are hot. The snow starts in October or November and continues until April.